Hello and welcome to the Hive podcast, the series that inquires into our relationship with one another, with technology and with the living world. Join me, Natalie Nahai, and some very special guests as we explore the pressing question of how we can support one another to envision and create a more flourishing future for all. For more information on today's episode and guest, please visit natalienahai.com/The Hive Podcast, and for additional books and resources, check out natalienahai.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. In this conversation, I speak with Mark Gallagher, author, conference speaker, and managing director of Performance Insights, an organisation that provides corporate clients with deep dive insights and executive coaching from the world of Formula One. His book, The Business of Winning: Insights in Transformation from F1 to the Boardroom, is a compelling insider's account of nearly 40 years in the Formula One industry, in which he explores what it takes to succeed in a competitive business with high technology, high finance, and immensely high stakes. Having joined the world of Formula One back in 1983, Mark's career includes more than a decade on the management board of the highly successful, race-winning Jordan Grand Prix team, running the world-famous Cosworth engine business, and establishing the commercial arm of Red Bull Racing, which went on to become 4 times world champions. During his career, he has worked with many of the sport's leading drivers, including former world champions Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, and Jenson Button. Today, he works closely with a number of the sport's major stars, including David Coulthard, Mika Hakkinen, and Jacques Villeneuve. Now, Mark may not seem like the most obvious guest to have on the show, but what's consistently struck me in our various conversations together is the power and potential that his industry holds in helping us to innovate, collaborate, and imagine our way out of some of the most pressing issues of our time. And most crucially, how we can unhook ourselves from reliance on fossil fuels and decarbonise our energy industries. Mark, I'm very excited to have you in conversation again after what has been quite a while since we were last talking for the Kogan Page book launches of our respective books.
Yes, exactly. That's one thing we have in common. We both managed to write a book with Kogan Page's great help and support during that kind of initial stage of lockdown. So I'm really happy to be on your podcast and to have this chance to chat with you.
Thanks, likewise. And it's probably, for my regular listeners, a bit of an unlikely pairing, given your fascinating background in the world of Formula One and many other things. So I want to start there, and I want to start with your book, which is called The Business of Winning, which is essentially a one-stop management guide for business leaders who want to explore how they can emulate the high-speed, high-impact approach to business that you have discovered and learned all about in the Formula One industry. So this probably seems like a bit of a strange conversation to be having given the theme of this season's podcast, which is, essentially looking at how we can support one another to envision and create a more flourishing future for all. But I was captivated by your talks and the book, and the ways in which you've described how the Formula One industry is transforming its approach to becoming carbon neutral by 2030, which is perhaps a bit unexpected, and the impact this is having on the hearts and minds in broader society. Can we start there? What's going on with the whole carbon shift?
So the whole carbon shift is, of course, driven internally in Formula One because we employ thousands of people and, of course, have hundreds of millions of fans around the world. And guess what? Everyone wants us to decarbonise. So our own people want us to decarbonise. I want my industry to decarbonise. So at a kind of individual level, there is this real interest in what can we do to contribute to this shift, which is absolutely essential that we do. And then there's the kind of the parallel aspect to it from a business perspective, which is, to be completely blunt, Natalie, does Formula One as a sport and all those technology companies involved in it, do we want to survive and do we want to sustain our business? So sustainability in the broadest sense. And the answer is, well, we can only do that if we are contributing positively to society and to the communities that we serve. Because if we just continue being what is politely referred to by people as a bunch of petrol heads, we're not going to be around for that much longer. So there's really, it's a combination of business imperative and then the desire of everyone involved in the sports community, which I inhabit.
And it's interesting because when people talk about sports, we don't necessarily think about racing. But of course, so many millions of people, and during the lockdowns, this was no different. Maybe we can talk about the virtual migration. But millions of people engage in virtual forms and physical forms of the sport, of F1, going to see the races or playing. Yeah. What do you think is the potential here for the Formula One industry to really lead the change more broadly, perhaps thinking about sort of social narratives about what you can do to decarbonise an industry which previously has been full of, quote, petrol heads? Like, what's the role of stewardship for F1, given that so many people are into it?
Gosh, how long have we got on your podcast to talk about this?
As long as you like.
As long as I like. Well, let me just take one example. Just prior to our recording of this podcast, is that this week on BBC Question Time, you have Sebastian Vettel, a German 4 times Formula One world champion, sitting there alongside politicians in the UK. And he's the one talking about environmental sustainability and saying one of the reasons why we have this profound crisis at the moment, in not just in the United Kingdom, but across many countries in Europe, around what's happened in the in Ukraine and with the Russian invasion and this whole question of energy and where's our energy come from and why does it cost so much. And you have Sebastian Vettel, a 4 times world champion, telling these politicians, well, of course, you have made the wrong decisions repeatedly over a number of years. You had a chance to get this right, and you chose to keep on building pipelines to pipe oil from Russia and gas from Russia to sustain our complete reliance on fossil fuels. So when you then zoom out and you say, what's Formula One's role? Well, one of the roles that we can have is that in 2021, 500 million people watched at least one Formula One race on television. So that's quite a decent chunk of the world's population. And it will come as no surprise to learn that most of those people come from developed countries. So we would have huge audiences in Europe, in Asia Pacific, certainly in North America. Actually, Latin America is very strong as well. So when we reach that size of audience, that means that we have a really important platform to talk about topics and then to help to put in place solutions. So this is why Sebastian Vettel, our own 7 times world champion Lewis Hamilton, they're really campaigning for change within our industry, change on topics around diversity, change around topics including environmental sustainability. And really, I find it fascinating that Sebastian will, in response to Fiona Bruce's question, don't you feel a hypocrite driving a Formula One car and then talking about environmental sustainability? And he says, yes, of course I do. I'm a complete hypocrite. But we all are. You know, we fly in planes or we drive, most of us drive cars or sit in cars. And he said, we all have these behaviours, which it doesn't take very much analysis to realise that we're all part of the problem. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? So we all have an individual opportunity to make changes in our own lives and in what we do in our day-to-day lives with our families, in our homes, with our recycling, with our use of finite resources, how we choose to travel. And then on a larger basis within the Formula One industry, we have these 10 Formula One teams packed full of incredibly bright engineers who are used to rapidly developing technology solutions. We like to do in Formula One in weeks and months what it takes heavy industry to do in years or decades. So therefore, give us a challenge and we'll take it on. And that's why this decade is so important to us, because we think that Formula One can, in some ways, demonstrate just what is possible if you really put your energy, excuse the pun, into decarbonisation. So as a result, in less than 4 years' time, sort of 46 months from now, the 2026 Formula One World Championship will feature cars that are not running on fossil
That's
fuel.
so exciting.
And that's not far away, and those technologies are in the pipeline. So we have quite an opportunity to play a role in communicating around these topics and then to putting in place some of the solutions that will hopefully benefit wider society.
It's funny, isn't it, when you hear about the conversations happening between our quote-unquote leaders, political folk, coming up against and criticising those of us who have perhaps a more business-oriented impact. So, if we're talking about people who are in the races or big companies that can make change, those folks have such a big opportunity to push the agenda forward where politicians just are simply failing. And I think the point that you made about Sebastian saying, well, yeah, of course, I'm a hypocrite. We're all hypocrites. That is the starting point, right? It's an acknowledgement of the current frame, saying the system is fucked. How do we acknowledge where we are and then figure out a way forward? Because unless you start by acknowledging the issues that we're all complicit in and stop throwing social grenades at people who are not the perfect role models, whether it's the vegan or the off-grid person, whatever it is, if we can get away from that and start from a more realistic starting place, then I think people will feel more empowered to take those initial steps. If you're saying to them, well, you're not perfect, a lot of folks are just going to shrug and be like, well, what's the point in engaging in the first place?
Yeah. This is what, you're kind of really giving me such an opportunity here to talk about things that I feel so passionate about, because I know on previous editions of your podcast, you've had guests who've talked about or quoted the climate scientist Michael Mann, who I kind of follow religiously for a very simple reason, which was I am very fortunate to have a home in Australia, and it was while I was in Australia a few years back that the country suffered its most devastating forest fires, and Michael happened to be in the country at the time and was literally giving a running commentary on why Australia is at so much at the forefront of facing these climate change issues, and of course particularly heat related. It's already a hot country in what might have been called normal times, and it's now truly abnormal. And when you sit in Australia, as I have done on Christmas Day, in 42 degrees centigrade, and you have your extended Australian family all saying, it never used to be like this when we were growing up in Australia in the 60s, 70s and 80s. So you don't need a lot of data. You're just talking to people who can, human beings are the greatest sensors in the world. They provide all the data we need. So, when you have people telling you this is our first-hand experience. So one of the points that Michael Mann has written about is that this notion that somewhere out there there's the perfect person who is doing all of the environmentally correct things. They're vegan and they don't drive a car and they don't fly. It doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. The reality is all of us, more or less, or certainly living in our Western societies, are all guilty of being part of a system which has chosen to just continue hoovering up what are finite resources. And it really even comes back to the fact that you can't open a business website or the Financial Times without continuing to read about quarterly growth. Everything's about growth, growth. How do businesses grow? How do we make more profitability? It all has to end somewhere. So we're all part of a system that is fundamentally broken in terms of what it's doing to the planet that we call home. So as a result, it needs this huge step change to take place. And I think that then coming back to the point around working in a sport like Formula One, it's maybe perhaps we feel so much in the firing line because we literally have spent 72 years burning fossil fuel, burning rubber, looks like we burn the planet live on television every 2 weeks. And then as individuals who are fortunate enough to travel the world going to these events, the weird thing, as I've written in my book, is that we're perhaps seeing the change more than most, because the many countries that I have gone to and visited during the course of my career, I've seen the changes on the ground, and it's devastating. So this is ultimately all comes back to the fact that, yes, we're not all perfect, but we can all play a role in hopefully putting together the solutions that will go some way towards solving this crisis, which is now absolutely upon us.
Yeah, I was watching one of the most recent editions of what used to be Top Gear. What's it called now? Grand Tour. I don't know, Jeremy Clarkson and the boys. Anyway, and what was really interesting has been mapping how their discussion around cars has shifted in the last 5 to 10 years. And also, I don't know if you saw it, it was Jeremy Clarkson had Clarkson's Farm.
I binge watched it in one day, actually.
Me too, during lockdown. And it was so interesting to see this kind of, I mean, he's quite a character, vilified and loved probably in equal measure. But to see the character of Jeremy Clarkson talk about and share a lot of this conflict that I think many of us experience in a personal way, but also in a social way, in a societal way. And to see the kind of the grappling, the reckoning that has to be done with the way that we live, the comforts that we've become accustomed to, and then the impact that that's having. And seeing people actually take stock kind of gives permission to the rest of us to say, oh, okay, well, they've been able to acknowledge something difficult, change their mind, and try to do things differently. And I think there's a particular power that comes from people like him, who's very popular in the broader culture, seeing someone's transformation, seeing their sort of emotional journey, and then realising, well, or maybe it's okay for me to ask these questions as well, and kind of to direct that shift. It humanises it somehow. Yeah.
It does, and it's really interesting you talk about Jeremy Clarkson. I live in Chipping Norton, so he is. His farm is about 2 miles from where I'm sitting at the moment, and funny. It's very topical because I know a lot of the people who live in his village, and they've dealt with the huge numbers of people turning up to visit his farm shop in the wake of his show on Amazon. But it is interesting, and Jeremy's 2 years older than me, and so we're petrol heads, dyed-in-the-wool petrol heads who have kind of grown up at the same era through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and you know that kind of generation that so many people point towards and say all you did was consume resource. And of course, people are right. And we didn't stop and think about it because it wasn't being raised as an issue. And I remember a few years back, bothering at the end of a very busy year to add up how many flights I had taken. And it came to 178 flights in a year.
Wow.
And I remember actually mentioning it in speeches and saying, so yes, we're very busy in Formula One. And for example, last year I took nearly 180 flights, and that was somehow kind of a badge of honour, just how hard you were charging around the globe.
That's more than 3 a week.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And now I look and I think, oh my goodness. I mean, really? It was ridiculous. It is ridiculous. And I know people who are still doing that level of travel in line of the work that they have chosen to do. And yet what, if you think about what's happened in the last 2.5 years, and particularly the two crises that are on a lot of people's minds at the moment, the war in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then, of course, the global pandemic. And you look at the implications of those two catastrophes on society and what that is doing in terms of recalibrating how we approach things like travel and climate change and work-life balance and where we work and where we choose to go to work. So I'll give you one example. I was at the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne last month, and I was there because I'd been in Australia for 4 months, so I was tacking it on to the end of visiting my family. And when I turned up at the event, in the press centre, there was no one. The press centre was empty.
Wow.
And this is an event with 400,000 spectators, but the media centre is empty. And I spoke to one of the few journalists there, and he said, no one comes to the races anymore. None of the media travel. Everyone now covers the sport from home.
Wow.
It happened because of the pandemic. And now, as we are coming out of the pandemic, media companies are saying to their journalists, you don't need to travel all over the world to cover the race. The press conferences are all streamed live. The press officers provide all of the quotes from the sports people on downloadable files on WhatsApp. So therefore, what's happening is that an entire community of international media have stopped traveling. And when you talk to them, they say, well, of course, I do kind of miss going to the events, but instead of going to 23 events a year, I'm going to go to 4, and I'll go to 4 closer to home. And actually, I've got my life back because I get to spend the weekends with my family. this is a kind of a microcosm of what we're seeing happening, I think, in the world of business and industry as a result of the global pandemic. And then you throw into that the impact of the war in Europe, and you suddenly have a Europe full of businesses and people who are saying, do I need to travel? Where is my energy source coming from? And in some ways, these two catastrophic events are somehow contributing towards us redefining how we live. And actually at a time when we needed to do that anyway because of the climate crisis.
I agree. I think the thing that's so heartbreaking is that so many lives are lost for so many more of us to just wake up and be like, okay, this is enough now. And I think the other thing as well from a behavioural science perspective is knowing about these things and knowing that for also, I share your experience for many years. Busyness and travel were signs of success and of fulfilling some sort of idea about what achievement looks like. And it is exciting to travel. There's also that very real part, going to places, having the adventure, meeting new people, being in a specific environment with a common purpose with other people. Like, there's a lot of beauty to that. But of course, the dark side is the impact that it's having on the wider world. But I think there's this, it's kind of this question of, how do we reckon with our human tendencies to get carried away with almost like the hedonistic side of life and deferring the externalities, deferring the pain, the cost, the risk, and finding ways to be more responsible? And I think these crises that you've just mentioned, unfortunately, they've served for many people as just that, as an actual, tangible, inescapable sign of, this is what's happening, you need to pull your fingers out now, let's do something differently. Yeah,
no question about it. And it is tragic. And one of the things I talk about in keynote speeches I deliver is how my sport has been through 20 years of profound change. And one of the takeaways that I always used to leave audiences with is that our experience is it takes an existential crisis to force change. We all are happy to sit on our hands and be complacent and hope that everything's going to stay as it is. And then you get that existential crisis and everyone runs around with their hair on fire. And then the clever people then sit down and work out solutions. And then you come out the other side and you look back and you think, why didn't we do all of this before? Why didn't we stop pumping oil from Russia before, or gas from Russia? Why are a team of 800 journalists flying to 23 Formula One races all over the world to sit in a room in a press conference and watch television screens? They could have been doing all of that from home years ago. And indeed, in the wider world of business, why have people been charging around the globe having meetings when we now know you can have that half an hour chat with your customer on Teams or Zoom or whatever. So there's all of this change is taking place. And from a Formula One perspective, I think, Natalie, the thing which gives me a lot of hope is that I've spent my entire life working in a sport where we set about trying to tackle quite profound technology challenges, and we bring smart people together and we deliver a solution. And quite often we deliver the solution when we didn't quite know how we were going to do that at the beginning of the journey. So we have an ambitious target. We don't quite know how we're going to get there. Well, it's very much like that with decarbonisation. People say, of course, you have the no-hopers. The people say it's too late. We'll never achieve it. Climate change is going to run away and, we've left it too late. The kind of the doom mongers. They are as problematic, I feel, as those who deny that there's climate change. Because if we all just simply give up, we're going to get nowhere with this. My experience in Formula One is you have a group of engineers who look at a particular problem and they start looking at where can we draw ideas and creativity and innovation from. And quite often it comes from outside our industry. So we're very good at integrating technology solutions that come from other sectors, other areas of research and development. And then we come up with a really powerful solution, which is one of the reasons people will forever say to me, oh, Formula One is so innovative. Yes, we are. That's what we do. Innovation is at the center of our technology. So in this decade, where we're going to abandon the use of fossil fuel and decarbonize all of our teams, all of our travel, all of our logistics, and every Formula One event will be decarbonised to achieve this net zero carbon emission target by 2030. It's real, it's meaningful, and it's measurable. Do we know all of the solutions? Absolutely not. We're in 2022, we have 8 years left, but we have a fair idea of the direction of travel. And I think probably for me, the only impediment to us achieving our objectives in terms of decarbonisation in the sport is that some of the players may not be honest players on this journey. And in the last couple of years, we've had major investment come into Formula One from Saudi Arabia. Aramco have become a major sponsor of Formula One. And the Saudi Arabian authorities maintain that they are serious about a decarbonised future. And it's hard to believe that, quite honestly, because they currently sit on a sea of oil, which they continue pumping. And we know that during the current crisis in Europe with the conflict in Ukraine, we know that the Saudis have been able to open the taps even more and pump even more oil in the last few months. So there's going to have to be a lot of proof in the pudding. And this is why the measuring of what we're achieving is so important, because unless you can measure the results, there's no point in people issuing grandiose press statements saying we're going to decarbonise. We've got to see the proof of the pudding, and we've got to see what comes out the other side. And certainly I'm hopeful that certainly within my industry we can develop solutions which will be applicable to wider mobility, wider transport, aviation, marine, shipping, road transportation. And if we can help in some way on that decarbonisation journey, I think it'll be possibly one of Formula One's most important contributions to wider society.
And especially having access to so many people who are so skilled and driven and talented, who are probably throwing their weight behind something they believe in. You know, if it's a decarbonisation mission with a very specific, quite short time horizon, then, you know, the incentives are very high and very immediate in terms of getting that right, finding solutions that you can then share with the wider community.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So in 2010, we